Hello everyone, crowd, both here in cyberspace. My name is Simon Jacobson. I dedicate the class to my new grandchild, Tzvi Hirsch Ben Sion, Marcus, who was just born I just had his bris on yesterday actually. I was in LA. I returned to give my weekly class here, as I do every week, going back now till from 1982. An unbroken chain. So long before you were all born, I was doing this class. It began a winter night, 1982, where a fellow who has already passed on since called me up. A mutual friend had encouraged him to get finally. He was looking for some spiritual inspiration, Jewish inspiration. And I was at the time working really in research and behind library walls. I was one of the top writers and the writer of the Rebbe Lubavitcher Rebbe's talks, which entailed, as some of you may know, a very intense effort of remembering hours and hours of talks that were delivered on Shabbos and holidays when no recordings are made and no notes were taken. So that was the world I was living in a very academic and scholarly environment. And he came and called me, so I said, okay, sure. I was always trained, till someone calls you for assistance, if you can offer help, you definitely should do whatever you can. And and at the time, I basically met with him and a friend of his. And what happened then was they started coming week after week. Now they happened to be people who were had connections to the arts and entertainment industry, so that's the people they brought along. So I get to know these different musicians and different artists. And this is the unbroken chain. No one had any plans or any ideas. It's just one of the lessons you learn, that God leads the footsteps of a person. You never know. You can make all the plans. In Yiddish they say, a Mensch tracht, Gott lacht, which rhymes, I don't know how you say it in English to make it rhyme, but a person thinks and God laughs, is essentially the expression, which means we make all kinds of very fascinating and complicated plans, and then sometimes things don't work out exactly the way we planned it. And there's a bigger plan, a greater choreography for life. And often when you see your life backwards, you look back, you see many times things that took a certain turn, twists and turns in our lives that we did not expect, and they ended up being the great blessing for us. So that's what happened. So spontaneously we kept on doing this, getting together every week, and we hit it off, basically. And it was a very fascinating interaction between a person like myself, growing up in a very traditional Jewish environment, and here were mostly secular Jews who had absolutely no yeshiva or education, and it brought out a certain magic that only happens when you're not hanging out with the same type of people. We all have our comfort zones, but like Abraham was told, we read several weeks ago, Lech lechem atzechem umeladechem beis avicha. All growth takes place when you leave your environment, your natural habitat. Because your natural habitat, which includes both as I've discussed that many times, includes your own subjective personality, your community, your culture, your home, the home of your parents, parental influences, tend to shape you. So you can't really know, am I me as a result of what others have done, or am I me because I'm me? And it's a big question to ask, what is your identity? Is it a product of others, a product of circumstances? And when can you really know and test that? Is by going out of the environments that have shaped you and then see how you are on your own. If you have no pressure and no one's expecting anything and you don't feel guilt of your mother or father or grandparents and so on, or community, how would you behave? That's when you really know what a person is made of, when they're not having to respond to other people's expectations and demands and so on. And that is really in general the sign of growth for all human beings. Many of us perhaps live our entire lives and we never cut the umbilical cord in the metaphorical sense of the word, where we always remain an extension of that which came before us. So yes, there are benefits in having deep roots and having connection, as I mentioned and discussed last week, to be a midget on the shoulders of giants and being part of a tradition, a legacy that goes back centuries, millennia, and so on. But there's also an element of being an individual. You are not your parents, and you're not a clone of those that came before you. You can be empowered by them, but the question is, what is your unique voice? And what is your unique contribution to life? And what are you going to do that was not done before you? Because if God put you here on this earth, there's no question that you're an integral part of the plan. You're not just here as an option, but something that you have to do that's indispensable. And this became the theme of those years and years of these classes. So essentially all of you here, anyone that's ever listening to these classes, know that you're like an extension really of word of mouth from the classes that went back to 1982. Even though it sounds like a long time, frankly, it's not so long in context of, let's say, Sinai goes back almost 4,000 years, 3,300 years, I should say. So the fact that a class 32 years is not that much. But nevertheless, relative to our times, not many things last long. So the lesson is that you start something good, you always continue it, you never know. I've met probably, at this class, 40,000 people since, over those years. And it's changed my life in so many ways, because as I said, you meet people, everybody has their trajectory, their story, their narrative, their bizarre twists and turns, and unbelievable things happen when you open yourself up to a journey that's beyond your own immediate human plans. So with that said, the class tonight is dedicated to my new grandson, and the title is the world getting better or worse? The reason I chose this title is precisely because in this week's Torah chapter, surprisingly, maybe to some of you, lies some of the deepest secrets of history in general, and especially our modern times. And I want to share a small introduction before I get into that specifically. Most people who hear about the Torah, the Bible, especially in our day and age, would at best say it's maybe the oldest book. But rarely will you find someone that can say, I can open up a Torah and find personal relevance in every story, in every narrative, in every character, in every event and episode in the Torah. Traditionally, Jews read the Torah several times a week. Shabbat, on Shabbos, we read the entire chapter. So there are 52 weeks in the year, and there are 52 chapters that correspond to each week. And every chapter has 7 sections, which in effect, every day of the week has a corresponding section. And if you go into devout synagogues, you'll find that not only is the Torah read, but everyone's listening very closely, and there are people who are very good at correcting the reader of the Torah, and they're always correcting words. Every letter should be precisely pronounced properly, etc., etc. But if you ask somebody, okay, so why are Jews so connected to this Torah? What is the connection? You see that Jews always sacrifice their lives for the Torah. We dance with the Torah on Simchas Torah. You're not going to find anyone, even great scholars of literature, that dance with a book of Shakespeare. It's not something you do usually with the books. You don't dance with them. The Jews also sacrificed their lives for the Torah. When there was a burning synagogue, God forbid, and there was Torah scrolls inside the synagogue, Jews would run in to save those scrolls as if they were children. And you have to wonder, it's a little strange. Well, it's a child, a life. Of course, you do whatever it takes to save a life. But a scroll, there are thousands of other scrolls. You don't have this one, you could always write a new one. So why risk your own life to go into a burning building? And this whole passionate and you can almost say fanatical connection to Torah seems odd. And you find in the Talmud actually different skeptics and philosophers who wondered why the Jews were so obsessive about this Torah. The story I mentioned last week, Rabbi Akiva, why, and he gave the analogy of fish and water. Just like a fish can't live outside of water, ein mayim el Torah, the Torah is compared to water. You can't live 3 days without water. So that's why we read the Torah every 3 days, at least every 3 days. And other analogies, we say in the evening prayer, chayenu ve'erech yemenu, it's our life and our sustenance. These are very strong words. You say them on oxygen, on food, on necessities to live. But to say it about the Torah, one has to say, what is this in the Torah that has this type of power? And frankly, if you ask Jews, especially even devout Jews, many will not have an answer. They'll just say, that's how it's been passed on. This is the body of work that we were given at Sinai. It's the great gift God gave us. It's the mandate by which we live, and this is what we cherish. But if you try to have to explain it to a secular person, very few people really know what to say. Say, I grew up with it, so therefore, yes, I find in it my direction in life. I keep Passover based on it. I put on tefillin every day. I go to synagogue. All it regulates all the laws, all the mitzvahs. But beyond that, you're not going to find usually very sophisticated responses. And yet the Torah remains the biggest bestseller. And films and books are written based on it. New films coming out all the time. Now a new one on Exodus. And of course the classic stories of the Garden of Eden, the good and evil, the Jacob wrestling with the angel, Pharaoh and Moses. These stories continue to capture the imagination, not just of devout Jews, but of people in general. So what is it? And the answer is, because the Torah was never seen by the Jews as just a book. They saw it actually as a roadmap, as a blueprint for life. There's a statement in the Zohar that says that just like an architect, the Medrash as well, what does an architect do before you draw plans, before you build a building? You have pisrois or pinkasais. These are like blueprints. You'll see a blueprint is a sheet of paper where the entire structure, as complicated as it is there in microcosm. You look at this blueprint, every detail is there. The door is in this, but it's not a structure. You can't live in a blueprint. But it lays out, and based on this blueprint, the contractors and all the workers will build the structure based on this blueprint. Without it, you'll have a mess. You'll have what they say, like a camel. They say a camel is a horse built by a committee. A blueprint creates a cohesive unit. So it says, why is that the case? Because that's the logical way, and the same is with God. Istako baraisa bara alma. That God looked into the Torah and created the universe. So first, he laid out his vision in a book called the Torah, and then he created the world accordingly. And that's why you have statements which seem odd right in the beginning of the Bible, in the Genesis. In Beres, it says, Vayemer Elokim yehi oyer vayehi oyer. Now, if you know Torah language, it's very, very succinct and very, very brief. There's no extra words. As a matter of fact, there's so many verses that require all kinds of commentaries to try to understand it because it's written so tight. So here, what's this expression? God said that let there be light, and there was light. You could have just said God created light. It's a far shorter sentence. So the Zohar explains, as does the Medrash, Vayemer Elokim, God looked into the blueprint and read light, let there be light, and therefore there was light. It was basically how he built it, like we build homes, like we built our structures. So the Torah, therefore, is not just a book, it's actually the blueprint of existence. So think of it this way. If a doctor takes an x-ray of your body, or other CAT scans or other scans in order to understand what makes you tick, and without that you can't really know what makes you be who you are, the Torah is exactly the same thing. It's a spiritual x-ray of the soul, and of the soul of all of existence, and the purpose of it. So it's far, far more than a book. It's essentially essential to life, because without it, we don't know why we're here, and we have no guidance in making sense of existence as we know it. Now, you'll say, okay, why is it then when I open up a chapter in the Torah or any particular verse, I don't see that? Because Dibra Torah b'loshen b'nei Adam, the Torah is written in the language of a human being. It's code. It's written in metaphor. So though the events actually happen and the Torah can be read as a book of stories, but the Zohar also says you can't read it as a book of stories, God forbid, because the truth is, behind those words lies a whole cryptic message. So every character and every episode and every event in the Torah is actually an event that's taking place right now within you. Because the Torah is your blueprint of your existence and of the entire universe. As the Medrash says, the entire world is a human being is a universe in microcosm. Olam katan zeh adam. And the whole universe is like an organism, a large organism. Today's science and physics has corroborated that an entire macrocosm of existence exists in every microcosm. Think of DNA. DNA is microscopic, you can't see it. But the DNA in a human being is constantly the same DNA in every part of the person. That's why DNA is such powerful ability it can be even used today as evidence, and so other things, that DNA describes the real forces that shape you. So the Torah essentially is the inner DNA of all of existence. And that's why it was worth following, not just following, but being Moshe Nefesh, giving your life to save the Torah, because it wasn't just a book. It was indeed a life. But, unfortunately, most people don't know how to read the Torah that way. Because without understanding all its dimensions, not just the pshat, the literal, of the remez and the drush, which is the allegorical and the talmudic and the legal, but also the mystical, sod, which is the esoteric, the spiritual dimension, you can't fully appreciate it. So, but when you do know how to read it, it literally can give you a whole new perspective on your life and on history and everything. We're living now in times where there's a lot of challenges. I just talked about it many times in this class here. You look at the Middle East, for example. You have 1.5 billion Muslims, Arabs. You have a few Jews, and you have 2.5 billion Christians. And you see these conflicts that have been raging throughout history continue to rage. With Jews always right in the middle, Jerusalem always in the middle, Israel always in the middle, the promised land. And if you read the Torah, you can understand immediately what the significance of it all is. Because the Torah talks about the nations at war, two sons, two brothers, Yaakov and Esav, who were twins inside of Rebekah's womb, and then she was a very difficult pregnancy. And she asked God, why was it so difficult? So God says, because Malum Yematz, you have two nations that are struggling inside of you. Nations, empires. And what happens? Lo and behold, as this history unfolds, it's exactly what happens. These two would give birth, Jacob to the Jewish people, and Esav to the rest of the nations. And Yishmael to boot, who is their uncle, or Isaac's brother, is the father and ancestor of the Muslim Arab world. Of course, Esav marries Ishmael's daughter, so there he got himself a more complicated gene pool in the context. So when you look at the nations of the world, very much associated with people who lived in the biblical times, and when you see that they're struggling, it's no surprise they continue to fight. So understanding their struggle helps us understand the struggles today. And frankly, I don't know another way to really understand why people still fighting over the same thing thousands of years. Who's going to control Jerusalem? It was first the Jews, then the Crusaders, then the Muslims, then the Crusaders again. Constant battle. And till this day, literally, that's the headlines. Who's going to control the Temple Mount? Jerusalem. It's exactly what the battle is about. If you look in Rashi, the commentary in that week, Parsha, told us, which this week's chapter comes to a conclusion. That's why I'm discussing it. So he says, Ilmole Tzur, if there was no, if Jerusalem was not destroyed, Tzur could not rise. Tzur was the antithesis, Tyre, or Tyre, in Lebanon. So there's always two forces at war with each other, and when one rises, the other one falls. And this continues to play itself out, as I discussed a few weeks ago at length, which I'm not going to go into right now. But I want to discuss, however, is a more broader, sweeping question about, as I said, the world getting better or getting worse. So what's the end of the story with Jacob and Esav? It's this week's chapter. So after 20 years, Jacob escaped from Esav, who wanted to kill him. He comes now back to Israel. After being in Haran, building his family, the 12 or 11 tribes, he now returns, and now he wants to re-engage with his brother Esav. So Vayishlach Yaakov Malachim Lefanov, he sends messengers, or angels, to go check out what's going on with his brother Esav. Is he still angry and ready to kill me, or is he reconcilable? And they come back with a bad report that Esav is marching with 400 men for war. So Jacob then prepares in the good classic Jewish way, in all possible ways. He firstly prepares with a prayer. He prays to God. Secondly, he doesn't just rely on prayer. He prepares a bribe to appease Esav. And thirdly, he prepares for war. Tefillah, Doiren, Mulchama. 3 things. Which itself is a lesson in life. That you have to cover all your bases. You can't just escape into a religious element, prayer alone. Prayer is important, is the foundation. But together with that, you have to do Ein Sem Chanal Anes. You can't rely on miracles. You have to do whatever you can from perspective of nature to prepare. If you have to appease him, bribe him, so be it. What ended up happening, the first two worked, the prayer and the appeasement, and the bribe worked. He did not have to go to war. And what is the conclusion of the story? Esav finally, they greet each other, and after all the gestures and overtures that Jacob made, Esav's heart in some way melted. Question is, the Torah talks whether they hug and embrace. The Torah discusses 2 opinions, whether it was a complete embrace or not complete. But regardless, it was definitely not a war. And then the classic words Esav says to Jacob, so now that we've reconnected as brothers, remember they were twin brothers, let us live together in peace. That's what Esav offers. And Jacob responds, you go ahead, Visnala li'iti, I will come slowly, because the children are young and the sheep are tender, and we're not ready to travel that quickly as that. We're not ready. So Rashi immediately jumps on this with a question based on the Medrash. It says, what's going on? Jacob knows fully well he's not going to live with Esav. He was afraid of him. So why is he lying to him? He's telling him, you go ahead and I'm coming slowly. And Rashi answers, no, he wasn't lying. He was telling him that I will ultimately come. There will be the day Mashiach comes. Vayishlach Hashem amlucha. And there will be Olu be'eretz edem, Olu Mashiach, be'eretz edem, that there will be the fulfillment that they will live together, side by side, but not today. So when he said, I'll come slowly, he wasn't just referring to that few days or few months. He was referring to all of history, essentially. And when you read the story a little closer, you'll see that it has tremendous lessons about understanding how history works and what actually happened in history since then. You also know in this week's chapter, before they meet, the famous story I mentioned before, that Jacob wrestles with Esav's angel, Esav's guardian angel, the mysterious man that he wrestles with all night. And that man ends up being an angel who's the one that actually gives us the name Israel. The fact that we're called Yisrael, both the Jewish nation is called Yisrael, Eretz Yisrael, is given to us not from God, not from our parents, but is given to us by an angel of Esav, which is interesting. The enemy gave us the name Yisrael, because Yisrael, as that angel tells Jacob in the morning, says, Ki Yisarisa im Elokim v'anoshim v'tuchal. Yisrael is an acronym. That because you have vanquished, you have conquered people and even God's angel. So Yisrael is a name that symbolizes being able to vanquish any enemy, even a divine force that represented Esav. And that's where the name came from. And Yaakov, from then on, was given an extra name called Yisrael. Sometimes he's still called Yaakov, but Yisrael becomes the most prominent and most precious name we have when it's used as in a very, very high complimentary way. And it's interesting that the Ramban, the Nachmanides, writes that before they finished the wrestling in the morning, so even though he could not win over Jacob, but he did cause damage. He displaced his hip, which is why we don't need the Gid HaNosha, the sciatic nerve, that part of the body of an animal, because of this displacement. And Jacob was hurt, had a wound that lasted the rest of his life because of it. And the Ramban writes something very powerful, which just again shows how it demonstrates its historic element, that this displacement of Jacob's hip represents all the tzaros, all the challenges, all the suffering that all righteous people would ever suffer from the beginning to the end of time is represented in that wound that Jacob incurred. So you see again that the events that happened then are not one-time events, but they actually affect history. The question is, what is the real meaning behind it all? And the history, and where is it going, and where is it headed to? So, being that we said that Jacob and Esau were like two nations, and that's not a commentary, that's the Bible itself. The Torah says, Lum Lum, two nations. So the real question is, what do these nations represent? And what's the point of them struggling? Why is there a struggle? So, briefly, Jacob and Esau, when you read the Torah, talks about their personalities. You'll see one was a Ishtam Yeshiv Ahalim, a simple person, a wholesome person, who was a scholar. That was Jacob. A gentle person. Kel Yankov is a gentle voice of Torah. And Esau was a Ish Milchama, Yedid Tzayid. He was a warrior that knew how to hunt. And actually his physical makeup was also that. He was very hairy and like a warrior, strong, warrior-like. And these are two brothers, twins. They're not cousins, they're not distant strangers, they are two brothers. The question is, what is the significance? They were both born two tzaddikim, two righteous people, Isaac and Rebekah. Isaac and Rebekah were both tzaddikim and tzadkanis. They were both very high. It's not like Ishmael. You can say his mother was Hagar, his father was Abraham. But here were two children born to the same father and mother, both circumcised at age 8 days old, and yet they so different. Vayigdal na'arim, as they grew up, they became so different. What is the meaning behind it all? So, the general explanation given for it is that one represents the body and the other represents the soul. Each of us has a body and a soul. We have the animal soul, we have the divine soul. One is a voice of reason, and a voice of scholarship, and a voice of reflection, and the other is a warrior. Look at your own life. We have a voice. We all have a part of us that is gentle and soft, which is hopefully expressed most with our families, with our children, and so on. But then we're thrust into a world which is a very competitive world, a hostile world, and we have to deal with even ethical competition is with negotiations. It could be cutthroat, and especially when you have to deal with the hostility of an unethical world, a corrupt world, where we have to find ways to protect ourselves. So if we only had a Jacob within us and no Esav, we would be vulnerable to the forces of a hostile world. If we only had an Esav without a Jacob, we would have no conscience, and we'd have no sense of soul and sense of direction. And this reflects the purpose of existence itself. Why God sent every soul into this world. The soul doesn't want to come to this world because it's a difficult world. It's far more peaceful and comfortable to live in a spiritual habitat. And yet we're thrust, al karcha chatachai, we're compelled, you have to come to this world because there's something you accomplish in this material world that you cannot accomplish in any spiritual world. And that is the transformation of a hostile environment into a home for God. That's exactly the purpose. To go into a difficult world and not lose sight of the purpose, and definitely not be seduced by it, by the world that is, the materialism, and realize that everything in this world, material, money, power, honor, vanity, is all temporary, and it's only a so-called temptation, a test for us to not succumb to it, and recognize that we're here to bring light into the world, to be influencers and reshape existence. Unfortunately, when we enter in this world, the challenge is great. As young children, we more or less are Jacob-like. We're gentle, we're soft, we're not duplicitous, we don't have echad b'peh, echad b'lev, we don't lie. But as we grow into adults, we start developing all the ugly features of adult life. We start becoming part of the world, in the sense much more Esav-like. And the challenge is, can you balance the two? Not only balance the two, but that Jacob should control Esav and not Esav should control Jacob. As Isaac blesses Jacob, that the older one will serve the younger one. So though on one hand, who's more powerful? So from a warrior point of view, the more powerful one is the one that is materially stronger, the brute strength of the warrior. But who is the one that has more a sense of direction, who's wiser, who has a sense of the higher purpose of existence? That's the Jacob. So the ultimate goal is for Jacob and Esav to reconcile. Usually you think the way it was taught in yeshiva or in school and so on, you always taught Esav is the wicked one, he's the bad guy. Jacob is the tzaddik. But they were both children of Rebekah and Isaac. How do you explain that? And from the womb they were struggling. Because the purpose is for them to join together. However, it's a big battle. And that's the battle of Jacob and Esav. It's a battle that each of us deals with every moment of our lives, and it's also the battle of history. What is the story of history? If you look at empires that have risen and fallen, which by the way is also alluded to in the ladder of Jacob's dream last week. The ladder is 4 rungs, so it talks about the 4 empires that will rise and fall. Like a ladder, you go up and down. So the rise and fall of the great empires, with the Egyptian empire, the Babylonian empire, the Syrian empire, the Persian, the Greek, and the Roman empire. These are the empires usually referred to when the Torah talks about the Daled Goliath or the Daled Malchus, the 4 great empires of history. And then, you talk about Roman, you can also extend that all the way till today, Malchus Edom, is the whole really Western Christian world. And then you have, of course, the Ottoman Empire, and before that, the Ishmaelite empires. So when you look at them all, what is the real battle that all fight for is how do you reconcile? How do you bring together what we call matter and energy, matter and spirit? And there's a very big tension that goes on between these two worlds. Some feel the only way is to destroy anything that's materialistic because it could be decadent. And others feel that you have to surrender to this world. So all battles come down to that. If you look at what caused the great Roman Empire to fall, ultimately all these empires, with all their money, with all their wealth, and conquests, and empires, and armies, and all the memorializing themselves, all fell due to vanity, due to their own sense of self, lacking humility. The secret of the Jewish people that are still here today, even though for centuries, with no nation, with no empire, with no country, with no land, even though we have the promised land, but we didn't live there, thrived because were not dependent on material strength. It was spiritual power that gave the Jews their strength. The sad part is that as soon as Jews lose their spirituality, that's when assimilation and intermarriage destroys them. But it's never other nations. Haman wanted to kill all the Jews. Hitler wanted to kill all the Jews. And they could not complete their mission. When the Jews are most destroyed, like Bilam recognized, when Balak commissioned him to curse the Jews, so he did whatever he could, but God told him, listen, you have to say what I tell you to say, and Bilam ends up giving the Jews the greatest blessings. Very similar to the Malach, the angel of Esav, giving Jacob the name Yisrael. It's exactly what Bilam did. The arch enemy of the Jewish people, commissioned to curse them, ends up giving the Matevu Elecha Yaakov some of the greatest blessings, including the blessings about Mashiach, which are all alluded to in that chapter in Balak. But then Bilam realizes something. It's a big secret. You can't kill the Jews. You have to have them kill themselves. So his basic advice, what ends up happening is, he tells Balak, you send the women to seduce them, the Midianite women, and that's how they will be destroyed, from within. Which is a sad commentary, but that's the reality. You can't kill them from outside because God protects them. But if they become decadent or they become immoral, then they become vulnerable. And you see that in history. It's a sad thing. I don't like to even mention it. But 500 years ago, 99.9% of the Jewish people were all observant. Today, I can't say the number is exactly the opposite, but it's almost the other extreme. And then we were oppressed by all the nations. We lived in anti-Semitic countries. You did not know where tomorrow was going to bring. There was no security. Absolutely not. Expelled, overtaxed, discriminated against, pogroms, killed. Just look at the history of the last 2,000 years after the Romans destroyed the Second Temple. One country to the next. Nowhere was there peace. And if there was, it lasted not too long. The English, the British expelled the Jews. Of course, the Spanish expelled the Jews. Wherever you go. And of course, the Holocaust, who can forget that? And yet, as a spiritual nation, they thrived internally. Today, you can send your children to any Jewish school. You can be as Jewish as you like. Anywhere in the world, practically. Even now in the former Soviet Union. There's nowhere where it's forbidden to be Jewish. And look what's happening. The status, the state of Jewish commitment is gone the exact opposite extreme. Okay, so some like to say, because when there's an enemy, it brings out your pride and your strength. Like they say, you don't know, we're like tea bags. You don't know how strong they are until you put them into hot water. And when there's no hot water, we become very complacent. It's true. Vayishman, Yeshurim, Vayivot. We become comfortable, apathetic, complacent, and we don't fight for our beliefs because there's no need. Everything is great. Like a guy told me the other day, he said, every time a new kosher pizza shop or sushi place opens up, he knows it's one step further from Mashiach. Because we're comfortable. What do you got? Nothing's missing. That's meant to be a joke. But the point is, it's an interesting phenomenon. But that is what kept what made the Jews unique, was that their power did not come from anything material. This is why Paro made the big mistake, Pharaoh. What did he do when he heard his stargazers tell him that a Jewish boy will rise and become Moses, become the Redeemer, and take the Jews out of Egypt? So he had a brilliant idea, very simple. Kill all the boys, throw them into the river Nile, and that's it. And very logical, and he must have thought he was brilliant with this idea. And unfortunately, yes, a lot of boys died as a result. And what happened by the Jewish people? So the husbands and wives got together, and the husband said, let's not have children. Every boy is going to be killed. And the woman basically said, if we don't have children, who's going to leave this godforsaken place? We were promised we would leave here. If we don't have children, there's not going to be a next generation. And that's why the Talmud says, B'schus nashim tzidkanius, in the merit of the Jewish women who understood, they found ways. Yes, boys were killed, tragically. But some women went out into the fields when they were expecting. And of course, Yocheved, the ultimate Moshe Rabbeinu, did survive. How? Because Yocheved ingeniously built a little basket. She smeared it with waterproof tar and so on, put it on the river Nile. In the river Nile, where Pharaoh threw the children out, where the Pharaoh would drown the children, that same river Nile ends up being a savior of Moses. And even though the river Nile was Avodah Zarah, because that's what they worshipped, the Egyptians. So the question is asked, you can't have a Noah from Avodah Zarah, but bottom line is that's why it was only a Sfasa, a Yair, on the edge of the river. That's why later Moses would not strike the river Nile. As much as the river Nile was Avodah Zarah because it saved his life, it was Aaron that turned the river into blood. Just interesting sensitivity. Something that saved you, even though it was a complete Avodah Zarah, complete idol. It was the Egyptian idol. But Moses did not strike it. And that ultimately saved him. He ends up in the Pharaoh's home and so on. So the point is, Pharaoh made the grave mistake, thank God. He measured power and strength by his own standards. What is power and strength? Great armies. The men, women and children could be subdued. What he didn't realize was the power of the Jews had nothing to do with physical strength. It had nothing to do with armies. It was precisely the women and the children's faith that he could not appreciate. How would he ever imagine that the women are going to say, let's have children, we'll figure out a way? He couldn't imagine that would not be rational for him. He thought his threat is the men. He'll kill the boys, it's over with. It was the faith, the Hisha Amdalanu, the faith, something that he could not measure as strength, which ultimately was his undoing, that allowed Moses to become Moses, grow up, and ultimately save the Jewish people, redeem them. All enemies, that's how they think. You think about power in terms of your own power. Which is, as I said, the irony that today, with all our comforts, so much is being deteriorated on the level of faith and level of commitment and so on. But I don't want to talk the negative, I want to talk about the positive. So the battle of Jacob and Esau is the battle of all times. It's the battle between matter and spirit, body and soul, form and function. Any other way you want to describe the struggles we all deal with. Living in a material world and trying to maintain some higher level of integrity. That's a battle. I know some people are cynical and say the battle is over, I already compromised everything of my integrity. But for some of us, I would say the battle still rages, and especially if you're still younger and you still have some ideals left and haven't given up on yourself or on others. So there is a struggle, and this struggle is exactly what was meant to be. There's an interesting disagreement in the Talmud between Shammai and Hillel. So they disagree about a number of things, especially their students. And usually the ruling is according to Hillel, but in this case, one of the exceptions, the ruling is like Shammai. What's the deal? What do they disagree about? It's an interesting argument, whether it's worth being born or not. Nuach la'adam shenivra shalei nivra. Shammai says it's more pleasant for a person not to be born than to be born, because life is difficult. And Hillel says, Nuach la'adam shenivra mishalei nivra. It's more pleasant for a person to be born, because in this world you can do Torah mitzvahs, you can refine the world, and so on. And they disagree, which is consistent to their approach, that Shammai is usually very harsher, l'chumra, so he sees the difficulties of life, and Hillel looks for the silver lining, l'kula. And yet here, the only time, one of the rare instances that the ruling is according to Shammai. which has many implications in how we say certain blessings and so on, because there's a truth to what he said. So the question then is, so why are we born? If it's more pleasant not to be born than to be born, and that's the halacha, so why are we here? Which I know a lot of people wonder, why are we here? And the answer is, as the Alter Rebbe, the Baal HaTanya writes, he says, Nuach is the word. Nuach. It's more pleasant not to be born, but it's more purposeful to be here. Who says life is about being pleasant? God didn't send us here for vacation. Didn't send us here for being, everything should be nice. It's 1 hour of the effort of the struggle in this world is worth more than the entire life of the world to come. On the other hand, the Mishnah says, 1 hour of pleasure and delight, satisfaction in the world to come is worth more than all the delights in this world. So seemingly like a contradiction, the first half to the second half. It's not, because the difference is, as some put it, depends nachas ruach beira or nachas ruach nivra. If you talk about God's pleasure, 1 hour of struggle in this world is far greater. Because the world to come, or Elam Haba, as I mentioned before, it's a comfortable place, there's no struggles. What's the big thing? That a soul that's not encumbered or bound to a body doesn't have to deal with health issues, doesn't have to deal with death, doesn't have to deal with parnasa, doesn't have to deal with competition, with any financial struggles. So what's the big chiddush? What's the big achievement that it sits and studies Torah all day? But if you talk about nachas ruach nivra, what's more pleasant for a person? For sure, sitting all day without having all these concerns is far more pleasant, but it's not more purposeful. So Shammai is ultimately correct, because it's not noach, it's not pleasant, but it's more purposeful. That's why we're here. So the struggle between Yaakov and Esav epitomizes that. That in a tzaddik's home, and a tzaddik and a tzidkan, we're not, as I said, we're talking here Isaac and Rebekah, the holy people. They had 2 children. Both children come from the same womb. Both were circumcised, as I said, at 8 days old. Now Yitzchak was 8 days, Yishmael was at 13 years. So there was a distinction. Here both. And their antithetical personalities representing the struggle that is the purpose of our existence. So the struggle is something we cannot avoid. The question is whether you understand its value and embrace it and do what has to be done to win the struggle. To fight the struggles of this life and say, I'm looking for a life without struggle, is just not possible. God is merciful, so we'll have a life of less struggle. But life and struggle is synonymous. Life is difficult. Everywhere you turn. Even if life is blessed and you have all the gifts and blessings in your life, there's still challenges. You have to deal with people, other people, you have to deal with children, there's education. There's, as I said, daigas haparnasa, there's issues of struggling for survival. Then you deal with the corruption and hostile environment. Then we have to deal with dysfunctionality around us, and especially if you grew up in a home which is not exactly a healthy home, so you got yourself a whole other peckle on your plate. So life is a struggle, but we're told you can win the struggle. We have all the power we need. So both on a microcosmic level and a macrocosmic level, both on an individual level and on a historical level, this is the story of life and it's the story of history. The battles of history. Who will dominate? Will it be materialism or spirituality? Every religion fights for that. And the question how they fight is the difference between whether you fight in a way that is with spreading light or you fight in a way that is terrorism and spreading death, which is a very different type of approach. But this is the battle that has been raging from the beginning of time and history. So when you ask the question, is the world getting better or worse? So here, what's the story in this end of this parsha, in the middle of this chapter? So Yaakov finally says, Esav says to Yaakov, so come, let's live side by side. He says, no. We have to go slowly. I'm not ready to live side by side. Body and soul still, I'm not in a place of peace. But the time will come when they will be. And that's the ultimate message. That the world will get more and more refined. That's essentially what Jacob said. And when you look in the Kabbalistic and the Hasidic texts on this chapter, it's a fascinating discussion how they talk about how the world evolves to a more refined state. That is exactly what happens. So if you look at the world that we live in today and the world that you live in 1,000 years ago, so individually you may have had far greater souls then and greater scholars. And that's why the Talmud says, Im Rishenim Kamalachim, if the early generations were like angels, we're like humans. If the early generations were like humans, we're like donkeys. So there's what we call Yuridas Haderis individually. But collectively, you have to say, based on simple faith, that as more mitzvahs are done in this world, the world becomes a more refined place. Or else the whole thing doesn't make sense. And you see it with your own eyes. I know people think that this is the worst times ever. History is a very strange thing. It always looks worse when you're on the ground. And you think back, you say, it must have been better then. Who knows? How do you know? You didn't live then. All the books written are all stories that people tell us about what happened then. But if you look collectively at the human race, I'll just give you a few examples. Politically, technologically, and charity and humanitarian wise. And you'll see the world you can't even compare the world. Let's start with a few years ago, there was an earthquake in Haiti, if you remember. It devastated this poor nation called Haiti down in the Caribbean. Now, Haiti is a country that has always been suffering, doesn't have much power, no wealth, and so on. Even natural resources is quite weak there. So what happened? Interesting thing. All the countries in the world competed not to conquer the country, but to help it. People shipping aid, medical supplies, volunteers, and so on. I don't know if you're a student of history or not, but just open up any history book. Unprecedented. Things are not done that way 1,000 years ago, nor even 500 years ago. Just a few hundred years ago, when a country suffered an earthquake or a volcano, what do you think all the neighbors did? They completely went in, they saw them vulnerable, they went and pillaged, raped, conquered, and took control of everything. When Greece suffered its volcano, and then Rome its earthquake, etc., or the other way around, that's what they did. Dog eats dog. Today you have a world where there's humanitarian aid. The United States gives out billions of dollars of aid to other countries. I'm not getting into whether you agree with where it goes and so on, but the fact of the matter is, why would people, taxpayers in a country like this, their hard-earned money, why are we giving billions of dollars to other countries? So Israel, yes, the Jews wanted to go to Israel, but it's not just Israel. Where does that come from, that type of attitude? And what are you getting in return? So the cynics will say we get in return is we create markets for McDonald's, IBM, and Apple, and whatever. But is that really the reason? That was the reason, not the reason. Because there's some shift that happened in human consciousness that took time, and what happened was that it ultimately refined the way we think about ourselves. Even if you find an ulterior motive, I have no problem. But the Greeks and the Romans didn't find ulterior motives. They saw the only option was you conquer the other. The concept of a humanitarian efforts is simply unprecedented. The amount of charity that this country gives out, again, I'm not getting now whether you agree with all its policies, both collectively as a country or individually, individuals. Warren Buffett a few years ago made that pledge. Now him and Bill Gates are giving out billions and billions of dollars. They're forcing all the Jews to do the same, shaming them into this thing called the giving pledge, that everyone give out 90% of their wealth in their lifetime. Many people laugh. I've heard people laughing. Why would anyone do that? You earned the money hard way. Why would you do that? Give it to your children. These are perfect examples of something that is not unprecedented. So you think to yourself, the concept Madana Mitzuyim Ka'afar, is it a true possibility where the Rambam says that when Mashiach comes, there'll be so much wealth that it will be meaningless, it will be worthless. Because if everybody has it, and they say if the wealth was distributed equally, there'd be no hunger in the world. Everybody would have exactly what they need. But you still have selfishness, you still have greed, and so on. So is it possible that there will be a world one day where materialism that we've learned through technology and others create so much wealth that it will have no value? Many people are terrified of the concept because what will make me special? What about all the money I saved in my pillows and my Swiss bank accounts. But you know something? This is the vision that Judaism looks at the universe. And if you think of it, it's not so inconceivable. I'm not saying it's easy to imagine people suddenly stop being selfish. But you see many changes that have happened that are interesting if you really take a bird's eye view and step back. Wonder where did it come from? Let's take another example, a political example. The concept of human rights. Again, if you're a student of history, you'll know that before 300 years ago, it didn't exist. There was no such thing as human rights. No such thing. Monarchs, kings, and the church leaders ruled the world. Whether it was the Western world, the same in the Eastern world, and that was it. They were the children of God. They were closer to God. They decided what your life is going to be like. The concept that you have freedom of religion, of speech, of expression, to do whatever you want to do, was non-existent. Sometimes you had a benevolent king who happened to be a benevolent despot, as they call them. So he was kind, so you happened to live. But then if his son was not that way, or his daughter, forget about it. How did that change? What happened suddenly? It didn't happen suddenly. It happened over time. Consciousness changes. It evolves. So from a Jewish perspective, the answer is exactly what Yaakov told Esav. I cannot live by you side by side right now. But the day will come when we will be able to live side by side, because you represent materialism, and unless you're refined, we will not be able to coexist. Which is also explains to you also another phenomenon, which is how the Jewish world has evolved. Once upon a time, Jews lived in Israel. Everybody lived in Eretz Yisrael. Once Joshua, after the Chumash ends, and Moses passes away, and the whole entire generation passes away except Yeshua and Kolov, and the Jews march into Eretz Yisrael, what's the next step? That's where they remain. They didn't go anywhere. This became their land. This is where they build the Beis HaMikdash ultimately. This is where they do the mitzvahs. This is the place they came home. They came home to the place that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were promised, and that was that. When did things change? When the temple was destroyed. Temple 1 by the Babylonians, and then before that the Assyrians who exiled the 10 tribes, then the Babylonians, and still the second temple 70 years later was rebuilt, and most of the Jews returned. But some remained. Some remained in Babylon, in Persia, some say went to the east. Different theories where the Jews ended up that didn't return with Ezra and so on. But everyone always knew that the center of Jewish life is Israel. Till this day, where do we pray toward? We pray toward the east, toward Yerushalayim, toward the Beis HaMikdash. And we constantly aspire, the Kabbalas Nidchei Yisrael, that God will gather the Jews back and will rebuild the Beis HaMikdash back to the center. But what happened in the interim? We became dispersed all over the world. Now, how do we understand that? What does that mean exactly? On one hand, it seems to be a major curse. Why? Why is it a major curse? Because of our sins, that's why we were dispersed. But on the other hand, there's an interesting Talmud that says, that God did a kindness, a charity, to the Jewish people, that He spread them among the nations. What exactly is a charity? We just said that's an exile. That's a displacement, not exactly a charity. So one of the explanations given, well, two explanations. A practical explanation given is that when there's corruption, you don't want it centralized. You want it spread out. Imagine having a Sanhedrin that's corrupt and controls everybody's life. That would not really be very cool. Ben Gurion, even when Israel became a state, so he suggested to the head of the religious party, he says, now that we're this. No, I'm sorry. No, the other way around. The head of the religious party suggested to Ben Gurion, now that we're a state, let's establish the Sanhedrin, Supreme Jewish Court. So Ben Gurion famously said, the problem is it's hard to find someone that's not Oyev Betza. It's hard to find someone that doesn't like a bribe, basically. So the religious guy said to him, for money you can find everything. For money you can find, in other words, even someone that is that doesn't like money. You get the idea. The bottom line is that there's a quality to decentralization when things are not in a great state. Think of it like this, if you have enemies coming, like what we read in this week's chapter, what did Jacob do? He separated the machnas. He separated the camps. Why? Because if they're all in one place and the enemy attacks, everybody is at risk. So it's a thing called diversification, like in investments. So what God did was, at tzedakah, He diversified. He sent Jews all over the place. So even if one community may be under attack, there's another community that will build. Which is what Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, ultimate wisdom was. The story is that when Jerusalem was under siege by the Romans, so it was a major dilemma, because they had stocks, but they began infighting within Jerusalem. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai had good connections to some of the Romans, the Roman emperor's son, and then ultimately the Roman emperor, and he saw that things were in a grave state. He got himself smuggled out, the Talmud says, from Jerusalem, in a coffin, actually, and he went and met his friend Vespasian. He met the head of the army, and he asked him one request. Since they were old friends, he says, I see you're going to destroy Jerusalem and the temple. Tell me Yavne v'chachamel. Give me Yavne, which was a city of scholars and sages outside of Israel, and its scholars. Spare them and give them to me. He was criticized by some at the time. You already had the connection. Why don't you ask him to spare Jerusalem and spare the temple? But now we know that his wisdom was brilliant, his foresight, because he realized that he's not going to be able to spare the temple. He realized that was over with. First of all, the sinas chinam, which was the cause for the destruction of the second temple, was out of control, the baseless hatred. And that was a Jewish problem, not a Roman problem. Secondly, he realized that God had already decreed. But what was his wisdom? He realized that now we're going to go into a long exile. We're going to have to build small communities of scholarship, of Torah, of prayer. Similar to what God says in Yecheskel about building a small shul, Migdash Ma'at, that once there's no temple, we're going to have to decentralize and build in each community. So this is a great tzedakah that God did. That even though we're displaced, but the cancer does not destroy the whole body, because it's separated, and each community will be able to build its strong communities. And that's what happened. From then on, what was the central goal of every Jew and every Jewish community? Wherever you go, make sure you build a strong, insulated community. A shul, I should go the order, a mikveh, a shul, a yeshiva, a place of study, a gemach, all the things that define a Jewish community. And they built it brilliantly. Even though we were expelled and we were persecuted, communities were built. Yavne v'chachamel in different places. So suddenly Pizra ben Umis, spread all over. And a Kabbalistic Hasidic interpretation, the Pizra ben Umis means the sparks that were now dispersed all over the world. So now Jews can go wherever they go, they elevate and refine the world wherever it may be. And that's what they did. That's why the world is a more refined place. And the ultimate goal, obviously, is to then reconnect and reunite it all with the coming of Mashiach, which is what Yaakov tells Esav, that ultimately Snalaliti will ultimately rejoin. So therefore, what you see changes in the world are not by accident. It's part of a process, part of a mysterious choreography that God set in motion, that yes, came first as a curse and as a punishment, but ultimately became a blessing in disguise, because we became forces that actually helped refine and change the world. But here's the interesting twist. For centuries and centuries, what dominated Jewish life? Shtetls. Small insulated communities. In Eastern Europe it was called a shtetl. In the Sephardic world it was called maybe whatever it was called. But it was strong strongholds of Jewish life in many, many different pockets, everywhere they may be. What's happening today? Today, it's almost impossible to create, I mentioned this to you before class, to create any insulation and walls and ghettos. Because today the internet and communications and travel has changed the whole world. Nobody is completely isolated. It's almost impossible to be isolated. Maybe the early years of your life, just like 9 months in the mother's womb, you're isolated from the rest of the world. The early years of your life, you go to yeshiva or you go to wherever it is, you're protected, nurtured by your family. But then once you're in the world today, the world is a global village. The whole world is on your fingertips today. Now, is this a curse or a blessing? If this happened to the Jews 500 years ago, it definitely would destroy them. But today, it doesn't destroy them. They have the opportunity to use it as a way to transform the world. And that's the third difference. I mentioned humanitarian and political rights. Now I'll talk about technology. Technology. This ultimately is an unbelievable blessing when understood and appreciated. So let me give it to you in context of an interesting episode in Jewish history. In early 19th century, in the 1800s, late 17th century, early 18th century, there was a major war between the Franco-Russia War, it's called, between Alexander of Russia, the Tsar Alexander in Russia, and Napoleon Bonaparte in France. It's considered one of the bigger wars, major wars. And Napoleon was marching on to Russia and was almost about to conquer Moscow. And what happened to him was exactly what happened to Hitler and German army. The cold Moscow winters, ultimately, they could not endure, and they ultimately lost the war. But there was an interesting debate among great Jewish leaders in Russia. Who is better to win the war? Is it better that Alexander win the war, or better that... Two of the people that disagreed was the Kozhnitzer Maggid and the Baal HaTanya, the Alter Rebbe. The Kozhnitzer Maggid felt it was better that Napoleon win the war. Why? Because Napoleon offered freedom. The Jews lived in terrible poverty in Eastern Europe and in Russia. And Napoleon was promising fraternity, freedom. It was much more a democratic perspective. And he felt it would be good for the Jewish people. They'd simply finally have a little less pressure, material pressure. The Baal HaTanya felt the other way around. That even though it's true, under Alexander there would be more poverty and more oppression, but he felt that spiritually it would be better Napoleon, because Napoleon also represented self-made man. Keichi ve'etzem yadi. That everything, like Pharaoh said, Liya eri v'aniyas esani. I created myself. It was anti-God, anti-faith. It was all about worshipping yourself and your own power. So he felt, Baal HaTanya, that would be destructive and destroy the Jewish soul. So their body may benefit, but their souls would be destroyed. The interesting story goes like this. Both the tzaddikim knew that who determines who's going to win a war, wars being fought. Leiv melachim v'sarim b'yad Hashem. It's Rosh Hashanah is the time. We say Al Medina's Bayomer. That's the time when in heaven they decree which nation is going to win which war. So that Rosh Hashanah they both prepared, each with their own kavanas, their own intentions. The Kozhnitzer Maggid was ready to blow shofar with the intention that Napoleon should win. And the Baal HaTanya was ready to blow shofar that the Alexander should win, Russian should win. Baal HaTanya did a kunz. Usually, when do we blow shofar? After reading the Torah, right? You daven morning prayers. Then there's the reading of the Torah and Haftarah, and then comes the blowing of the shofar. Then there's Musaf. He got up that morning and took a minyan and blew the shofar in the morning before Shachrit, before the morning service, which you're allowed to do. It's just not usual way we do it. So when the Kozhnitzer Maggid came to blow shofar in the afternoon, whenever, 12 o'clock, whenever it was the time, as he put the shofar to his lips, he said, the Litvak Chenariz Gechapt, something of that nature. The Baal HaTanya was referred to as the Litvak, because he came from that world. And because he realized that the Baal HaTanya had already blown shofar with that intention. And what happened? Yes, that year, Napoleon lost the war. So it's an interesting episode, which meant basically that there's a point, if you take a child and don't protect him or her in their early formative years and says, you know what, go out into the world and make a life for yourself. It's inevitable. The child is young. The sheep are tender, as Jacob said to Esau. There's no way a child doesn't have the arsenal, the resources to protect itself from the hostility and the corruption of this world. That's why God made it in a way that the early years of a child's life, it starts in the mother's womb, Lamdim, Esei Kol HaTorah Kula, the entire Torah is taught to the child. Then the child comes out, and the way it's supposed to be is nurtured, protected by parents, surrounded in Daled Amas, in the 4 cubits of Torah, Halacha, Tefillah, prayer, holy environment. This is meant to be a training period where you reinforce and strengthen the child, that when the child grows out into a world where it has to make a living, and deal with the struggles of life, it has all the resources it needs. Think of sending a soldier out into a war and never training him. There's no way he's going to be able to fight. So similarly, history was exactly the same story. In the early parts of history, there was no way that the Jewish people, the soul, would be able to survive in the material world. That's why there were so many forces that protected. And that's why the Baal HaTanya felt the Western world would be too much of a challenge. But then times change. The child gets older, the world gets more refined, and you get into a place where you can finally go into France and into the Western world and into the world of technology and transform it. So it's all a matter of stages. You find, for example, Noach was told to boy ala teva. He should go enter the ark. The Baal Shem Tov interprets teva comes also from the word tevis, words of Torah and Tefillah, because teva also means words, the letters of Torah and Tefillah, actually. But then he's told say minat teva, because once he gets comfortable in the womb, he doesn't want to go out into a hostile world. The Meraglim had the same problem. They didn't want to go into a land that consumes its inhabitants. If you're comfortable in your mother's womb, or you're comfortable in your kolel, or in your holy environment, why do you want to go into a world that's hostile? Like I said before, the soul doesn't want to enter this world. Yaakov doesn't not interested in engaging with Esav. But that's where the purpose of life is. So first early years, yes, you have to reinforce yourself. But then comes a point that you're strong and mature enough that you can enter into a world and not only not be affected by it, but you should transform it. This is the story of history. So the Jewish people on Mount Sinai were not just given a mandate just for themselves and their families. The Talmud says something interesting, that when the Torah was given at Sinai, the whole world froze. Tzipor le'tziftzif, a bird did not chirp. Everything froze. And the nations of the world came to Bilam and said, what's going on? What's happening? So he says, Hashem eiz la'amay yitin, Hashem yivarach es amay v'shalom. God is giving His strength, His Torah to the world, to the Jewish people. The question is, what does the world have to do with it? It's a private affair between God and the Jews. But it's not a private affair. Because the point of the Torah was not just to give Jews mitzvahs what to do, it was giving them tools to transform this world. They can stay in heaven and study Torah. Mitzvahs can't be done there, physical mitzvahs. The point was to transform the world, which explains another episode, also relevant to this week's chapter. It says, on Sinai, God went, Machzirun Chol Umas, He went to all the nations and offered them the Torah. Specifically to the children of Esav and the children of Yishmael. And they looked into, smart people, they said, let's see what it says in the Torah. Before we accept the contract, we got to read it. So what they do, they looked into the Torah. It says, do not murder, do not steal, do not be inappropriate sexually. No, it's too much for us. They rejected it. So God went to the Jews, and they said, Nasa v'nishma, we will do, and then we will understand, or listen. They accepted it all. So the big question, everybody asks, what's going on here? The Jews just suffered for 210 years in a terrible Holocaust. God promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that your children are going to receive the Torah, they're going to go to Israel, the promised land. And suddenly God decides, you know what? Maybe there's another customer. They paid their dues, the Jews. What would happen if Esav and Ishmael decided, the Bnei Esav, that yes, we want the Torah? What would happen then? What would happen with the Jews? What happened with us? So, on the other hand, you can't say God's playing a game. If you knew they're not going to accept it, why are you offering it to them? It's a very basic question. The Zohar gives a very powerful answer. Because God was not playing. He knew that the Torah ultimately will be also embraced, the Torah values, the universal values of the Torah, also by the other nations. And Esav is a son of Yitzchak and Rebekah. And Ishmael is the son of Abraham. And by offering it to them, he was opening the door, the Zohar says, to Oz Epech Kol Amim Sofa Brura, to the time when Mashiach would come, when all the nations would embrace one God. That all the nations will see the temple as a house of worship, and they will climb that mountain. They will remain nations, but they will recognize the one God. So he paved the way by offering it to them. He knew they wouldn't accept it, but he knew that ultimately they would, and they did. 1,000 years later, the pagan world of children of Esav, as distorted as Christianity may be, nevertheless they embraced basic principles of Jewish and Torah thought. Maimonides writes that, and then 700 years later, Muhammad and Islam transformed the children of Yishmael, and they embraced these principles. Maybe not completely, maybe not in its fullest sense. Maimonides writes, this can only be seen in the versions of Rambam that are not censored. Ironically, one of them is the Roman edition, Tfus Remi, that Maimonides writes that after criticizing Christianity and Islam, he writes that God in his mysterious ways allowed these two religions to spread all over the world to help spread the message of unity and Mashiach. So he writes, which sounds controversial, but if you think about it, it makes total sense. The end of the day, Abraham's children and Isaac's children will not embrace ultimately what their parents taught them. It may take a lot of time and it may take effort. Now I know what I'm saying may sound radical to many people, but if you look at all the sources that I'm citing, you'll see it's very obvious. God created the world in order to transform it. The Torah and the Jewish people are here as agents to do that. Initially, yes, you do it in your own home, in your own community, but ultimately, Ner Lagoyim, it's about transforming the entire world. And remember, if you don't transform the world, it transforms you. And we live in this world. So it's not just about insulating ourselves, it's about spreading. When Ishaya Hanavi, and we say this in the Haftarah of the last day of Pesach, says, Lo yareu v'lo yashchisu b'chol har kodesh. There will be no more evil or destruction on my entire mountain. Ki mala ha'aretz deis Hashem. The whole world will be filled with divine knowledge as the waters cover the sea. Who's he talking about? So Maimonides clearly says at the end of Hilchos Malachim in his Yad HaChazak, in his Mishnah Ter, he's talking about all people. Because all nations will be involved in knowing God. And then the Jews will be the teachers and they will have their unique role. So it doesn't take away from the uniqueness of the Jewish experience or the Jewish role, but it means that all the nations will be transformed. And what you see today, the changes in the political and humanitarian and technological landscape, are signs of a refined world. Now, by no means am I suggesting that the world is perfect. We know there's anti-Semitism raising its ugly head again. We know that Jews were just murdered, massacred in Har Nof, and there's stabbings going on in Eretz Yisrael and other places. So I'm not suddenly suggesting the world has reached its perfection. But if you look at a trend, if you want to look at a bird's eye view of history, Jacob says it all to Esav. We will live side by side, but not yet. And as time passed, the Jews became more and more engaged. Pizram ben Umas. There's no way that the Jews who lived in the Midbar could have spread all over the world and maintained their integrity. They needed to be isolated and insulated because they just were a nation that just came out of Matan Torah. Just out of Egypt. They were just a fledgling young nation. And this is the story of history. The Torah talks about the early years of the first years of the first generations. People lived 700, 800, 900, 1,000 years old. After the flood, life expectancy became 120, which is as it is till this day, the max. What changed? So the Talmud says something interesting, that the first generations nezunin b'chazdish al Kadosh Baruch Hu. The first generations were like children. God spoiled them. He gave them many, many years. They didn't earn their way. What happens if you give someone a lot of years, they don't earn their way? They get corrupt. And that's exactly what happened. After the flood, things turned around. I will no longer give you 1,000 years. Imagine people 1,000 years. Even with the amount of time we have, look how corrupt people can get. The corruption of 1,000 years would be a devastating. Now I'll give you far less years. But now you have to make it work from your end. So you'll see in general, all of history, and also individually, like I said, earlier stages in life, you have to be protected, or else you'll be destroyed by the universe. But then as you mature, you're able to engage, and you have the wherewithal and the strength to be able to not just be influenced, but to influence everything around you. This is the story of Jewish history. So as much as Golus, which means the exile and displacement, is considered to be a punishment, or you could say cause and effect, due to our own inability to appreciate the temple, Now you want to have a temple back, you better earn your way. I'm not going to give it to you as a gift. Vayishlach Barditchever has an analogy. It says on Shabbos Chazain, the Shabbos before Tisha B'Av, it says that Chazain, what means Chazain? The vision of Isaiah, it's usually a vision, a negative vision. But the Vayishlach Barditchever always has a positive twist on things. He says, why is it called Chazain? Because every Jew is shown the temple, the third temple, from a distance, in order to awaken a yearning to regain that temple. And he gives an analogy that there was a father who loved his son very dearly, so he knit him a beautiful garment, kshenas pasim, like Jacob would knit for Joseph. And he gave the child the garment as a gift. What happened? The child was playing, and the garment tore. So the father went and knitted him a more beautiful garment and gave him the second garment. And what happened again? He got it torn. So the third time God said, listen, I'm not going to give it to you now. I'll sew this garment, and I'll show it to you once a year from a distance. And now you want to have it, you earn your way, then I'll know you'll appreciate it so you won't tear it again. He says the first garment is the first temple, the second is the second temple. And then God said, the third temple I'm not giving you so fast. Do you want it? It'll be eternal. But now you're going to have to earn your way. That I know when you get it, you will not blow it. So that's the nature of the beast. Which means, or I don't know if the beast is the right word, the nature of way of all flesh. That earlier stages, we are not ready to engage. And that's what Jacob said. We will walk slowly, but we will ultimately join together. So in the context of history, life, the world has become a more refined, a more humanitarian, a kinder place. No question about it. There's statistics that show, and there are actually graphs, that a graph that the drop of war in the world has dropped dramatically in the last 300 years. With the last 50 years being almost no wars. Compared to World War II, World War I, and the wars prior to that. And you say, what do you mean there's no wars? There are wars, yeah, but today, war is a whole piece of news. And it's wars that are very localized. They're not compared. You know how many people died in World War I and World War II together? 120 million. You're not talking about a small number. There's nothing close to that. And the wars prior to that, you have the 100-year war, these wars. So the world has definitely become a more refined place, and it's not a surprise, because ultimately every mitzvah done, every good deed done does not die, and in some way has to change the world. It's fundamental to Jewish faith. It's fundamental to faith in general, because if not, what are good deeds doing? If they're not changing anything, why are we doing them? What's the point? So I can elaborate more and more, and I see time is already curfew, but I want to just conclude the following. The Maggid of Mezritch Maggid, some say Beis Yosef. This story is told by about so many different Gedolim, but it's a good story regardless. So one of them was saying he was teaching his students some Talmud, and he said some major chiddush, an unbelievable, innovative thought and an idea in the Talmud. And the students were completely overwhelmed by it. They couldn't believe such an unbelievable idea. And only the Maggid or only the Beis Yosef could say something like that. One of them was traveling back and he was thinking about it. He goes and stops into a shul to daven mincha ma'ariv, afternoon and evening prayer. He sees a group of simple Jews learning Gemara, that Gemara. And he happens to listen in, and he hears suddenly one of them says exactly what he just heard a few weeks ago or a few days ago from the Maggid. So he's like, really? How's that? This was something that all the students who were great scholars themselves hadn't heard such an idea their entire life, and suddenly they come in as simple people are saying the same idea. Simple, relatively speaking. So he goes back to his teacher and tells him what happened. So his teacher answered something very interesting. He said, once you bring an idea into this world, ba'avra elam, once it enters this world, then it becomes easier for anybody to innovate the same idea or similar. Because it's a collective connection that we have. Once some breakthrough happens, and that's why you have, for example, in the Zohar, you'll see the word Pasach, Rab Shimon, and so on. What does Pasach mean? That he opens up a new channel. Once you open a new channel of ideas, those ideas begin to affect everyone, even though they don't know it. And you see this. Look at the Industrial Revolution, 1840, and the developments in technology. Suddenly you see developments happening in different parts of the world and the people never spoke to each other. How's that happening? Because once certain things are introduced in the vibes of existence, it makes it easier, paves the way that everybody else can relate to ideas that they themselves on their own would never have reached. It's a tremendous thought if you think about it. And that's exactly what we did. The Jewish people introduced to the world, starting from Abraham, the concept of justice, virtue, tzedakah, mishpat. All the principles that define today a humane society are all Jewish concepts. They're all Torah concepts. And by doing it slowly, year after year, year after year, it changed the world. And the world is a better place for it. There's still work to be done, especially on an individual basis. But make no mistake about it, the world is far different than it once was. And we could be proud and say that's because we stuck to it. When the world was busy eating each other alive, cannibalism, they're busy destroying each other, we believed in the concept that every human being is created in the divine image. All men are created equal. There's a book I always refer to, On Two Wings, from Michael Novak, that he writes about how the principles of the United States are all built what he calls Jewish metaphysics. Torah, basically. And he documents these in the Founding Fathers' letters and correspondence. You find their references, not to Christian ideas, definitely not to Muslim ones, to Jewish Torah ideas. So, I'm not saying this to toot our horn or to pull rank, but the fact is that our ancestors paid prices, and it was not in vain. They changed the world. And even going through a world like Hitler and the Nazis, and we stand strong today, and we did not become bitter, and we did not become wrong, we didn't become like our enemies, that itself is a lesson that people learn from. So they may hate us, but they respect us. They may hate us, but they see that we have changed the world in many ways. And I say it as a proud Jew, and I say it as something also to know, we live in a material world today, and we live among non-Jews, we live in a secular world. We do business with that world. But you're more than just a business person. You're a divine agent to bring God to this world. And that's the mission that never should be lost upon any Jew. No matter what you're doing, that's why you're here. You're here not to make money. You're not here to become part of the problem or part of the material existence. You're here to change the world. And you can only change the world when you realize that you're above it, that you're not made of it. That's the battle of Jacob and Esav. Jacob is made of a soul. Ishtam Yeshuv Ahalim knows that is his priority, but then when he enters and engages with an Esav, he knows his mission is to transform that part of the world. Even when you enter and you put on Levushe Esav, which means you dress the garments of a warrior, you always maintain the Kel Yankov, even when you die in Yedei Esav. So we may be involved in this world, but we're not made of this world. And we are here to teach every person on earth that that's exactly what the purpose of existence is. So in the final analysis, yes, the world has become a far better place. But that still leaves one big question, is what are you going to do tomorrow and tonight and the next day? How are you going to do those last steps that Jacob said that we're going to walk slowly, but we will ultimately transform, and then we will live side by side with you. So ultimately it comes down to that Jews not just to be defensive, not just to say leave us alone. We're here to be a light and a way to transform the material world, including the non-Jewish world. So with that said, I hope all of us can do it each in our own way. It's not something we necessarily taught in yeshiva, not necessarily taught in our homes, but the best defense is offense. Trust me. You are an offense, and you influence those around you, you'll be far less influenced by them. I don't see any other way in the world that we live in today. You can put up all the walls and all the defenses and say everything out there is evil and the devil, but you're doing business with it. And you're engaging with it. There's no way it doesn't impact you, unless you impact it. So you're either being influenced or you're influencing. It's actually halacha in Torah. It says I did the Torah lemivla lepolit. When you're busy absorbing, you can't be transmitting. And when you're busy transmitting, you can't be absorbing. So you're busy teaching, you can't be learning. When you're busy learning, absorbing what others are doing, then you will not be busy transmitting. So the more you transmit light, the less darkness will affect you. That's the rule, especially in our day and age. So again, I dedicate the class to my little new grandson, who's now entering from the Yaakov world into the material world. So he's still pure. I hope it stays that way as long as possible. And you should all be blessed. Those of you that have children, don't corrupt them earlier than necessary. Actually, never corrupt them. I should rephrase that. And God should bless us all with the strength and the ability to keep ourselves connected to what matters, what's eternal, and allow that to help transform that which is the material and the temporary. So, we will continue this class next Wednesday, as usual, as well as Philip gives his class Thursday night. And what other announcements do I have to make? As always, if anybody needs any assistance in any way in your spiritual journey, feel free to contact me or my office, Meaningful Life Center, meaningfullife.com. And everyone have a very pleasant and powerful, enlightening week. Thank you.